The jury unanimously found that defendant should be sentenced to death.
6 years ago, the Bay Area thought it had a missing child's case on its hands, only to later discover a dark and disturbing truth. Right now, convicted killer Granville Ritchie is sitting on death row for the rape and murder of 9-year-old Felecia Williams back in 2014. But Ritchie says he doesn't belong there. He claims prosecutors broke the law, and now he's appealing his death sentence to the state Supreme Court.
The apartment looked like any other that afternoon. A 9-year-old girl had been dropped off there, left in the care of adults her family trusted, but barely knew. By the next day, she wasn't missing. She was gone, and the story the adults gave police that first night wouldn't survive very long. But how did we get here? You're watching Guilty Crime Files, where real cases involving ordinary people reveal warning signs too important to ignore. Like, subscribe, and share. Because awareness could save a life.
At 5, the same jury who found Granville Ritchie guilty of raping and murdering a 9-year-old girl must now decide whether Ritchie will be put to death. ABC Action News reporter Isabel Rosales live outside the courthouse in downtown Tampa tonight for us. Isabel.
Jamison Ritchie sat there in the courtroom, stone face, unmoving, as his defense attempts to save his life. But the most compelling part today, it wasn't the experts, it wasn't the attorneys. It was the words of the mother of Felecia Williams, the words she had for Ritchie.
Felicia's death has affected my life and took its toll on my entire family. Even though it's been 5 years, it feels like 5 days ago. I have not yet returned to work. She never met a stranger. She came home at times after riding her bicycle bearing gifts from where she helped a neighbor or elderly person take out their trash, feeding their dogs, or just sitting on their porch and keeping them company.
On the afternoon of May 16, 2014, in Tampa, Florida, a 9-year-old girl named Felecia Williams called her mother and asked permission to spend the evening with a family friend. Her mother said yes. It was an ordinary request. The two of them had known each other for years. Within hours, Felecia had vanished. By that night, her disappearance was being treated as a missing child case. 2 days later, boaters discovered a body in the water near a causeway on the western edge of the city. What followed was a 5-year wait for trial, a jury that would hear 2 different men's worth of lies from the same man, and a phone that told investigators exactly where he had been. The story investigators were given that first night about how Felecia disappeared did not match what the evidence would eventually show. Felecia Williams was 9 years old, a 3rd grader at Edison Elementary School in Tampa. Her family called her Sugar Plum. Her mother, Felicia Demerson, would later describe her simply: she loved people, she loved life, she loved animals, and she most definitely loved her family. She was one of 6 girls in her family, raised on East Ida Street in Tampa, in a house full of sisters and noise and ordinary weekday mornings. Bonnie Wiley wasn't a stranger. She was a cousin to one of Felicia's older sisters, and she lived nearby. The two of them had grown close. They rode bicycles together. They went to church together. They spent afternoons at the park. Felecia followed her everywhere. Wiley, in turn, had started calling herself the girl's godmother. On the afternoon of May 16th, Felecia called her mother and asked if she could go with Wiley that evening. Her mother said yes, the way she always had. She believed the two of them were headed to church. That belief would turn out to be wrong. And it would take 5 years. Through pretrial motions, delays, and a trial date pushed back more than once before a jury ever heard why. It started on an ordinary day, on an East Tampa street. A man stopped her and asked for her number. He introduced himself as Trevor. He had a Jamaican accent, and he talked about a wealthy future he said that was coming. She was charmed enough to save his number in her phone under a different name. My husband. His real name was Granville Ritchie. At the time she met him, Bonnie Wiley was 23 years old. She had no prior criminal record. Ritchie was 35, more than a decade older. By 2014, Ritchie had an adult criminal record, mostly tied to drug offenses. There was also something else in his history: prior allegations involving unlawful sexual contact with another minor. Those charges had been dropped, or were still pending. Ritchie had not been convicted of anything at the time. He also had a girlfriend of 7 years, a woman named Calissa Kelly, who lived across the bay in St. Petersburg. Wiley did not know about her. None of this was something Felicia's family had any way of knowing either. To them, Wiley was simply a trusted family friend. What she had brought into Felicia's life that spring was a man almost no one around her had actually looked into. On the afternoon of May 16th, Wiley and Richie picked Felecia up together. They stopped for fast food before driving to an apartment in Temple Terrace, the home of Richie's mother, where Richie was also staying. It was an ordinary errand. Nothing about the drive or the stop for food looked dangerous. Sometime after they arrived, Wiley decided to go out again, this time to buy marijuana. She considered bringing Felecia along. Richie told her not to bother. He said he would watch the girl while she was gone. It was a small offer, made without ceremony. Investigators later corroborated that Wiley left the apartment sometime between 4:50 and 6 p.m. Felecia stayed behind, alone, with a man she had met only days earlier. Nobody in that apartment understood, in that moment, what that decision actually meant. While Wiley was gone, Richie raped and fatally assaulted Felecia Williams inside the apartment. When Wiley returned roughly an hour later, Felecia was nowhere to be found. Wiley was gone for about 50 minutes. When she came back to the apartment, she found Richie shirtless. He told her he'd given Felecia money to walk to a nearby CVS for candy and that she hadn't come back. Wiley went to the store herself. A clerk told her she hadn't seen the girl. When she returned to the apartment, she says she panicked. Richie gave her a drink, and the two of them stayed there together as the evening went on. As night fell, they agreed on what they would tell everyone else. Later, in his own interview with detectives, Richie offered a different version still, that he and Wiley had been together in another room, and that Felecia was already gone by the time they came out. None of the versions turned out to be true. They agreed to tell Felicia's mother a different story, that Wiley had met Richie's mother at the apartment, and that Felecia had wandered off on her own while Wiley was in the shower. Richie wasn't in that version at all. Wiley called Felicia's mother. She said Felecia was missing. Demerson drove straight to Temple Terrace and flagged down a deputy, showing him a photo of her daughter. A missing child report was filed just after 10 p.m. The next day, when Felecia still hadn't come home, Wiley says she finally asked Richie directly whether he'd had anything to do with it. He told her no. She said she believed him. That night, while the search for a missing 9-year-old was just beginning, a call was placed to 911 from Richie's own phone. It lasted only a few seconds. Prosecutors would later tell jurors it was Felecia herself who made that call, while she was alone with Richie in the apartment. Around the same time, Richie's cell phone was already on the move, west, across Tampa toward the water. At the time, no one tracking that signal understood what it meant. Temple Terrace Police, along with the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, launched what one investigator later called a massive search, by air and by ground, through the night and into the next day. 2 days later, on May 18th, boaters found a body floating against the rocks and mangroves near the Courtney Campbell Causeway. An autopsy confirmed it was Felecia. Her death was ruled a homicide. Investigators collected sand samples from the site where her body was found, and separately, from Granville Ritchie's car. They also photographed scratch marks on the car, along with sand and vegetation prosecutors said matched the thick mangroves lining the causeway where Felicia's body was found. On May 21st, 5 days after Felecia disappeared, U.S. Marshals arrested Richie in St. Petersburg. The charge at first wasn't murder. It was drug possession. It took nearly 3 months of investigation before prosecutors formally charged him with Felicia's murder that August. By then, he was already being held on a separate, unrelated charge of unlawful sexual activity with a minor. It didn't take long for the two cases to become one. Cell tower records showed Richie's phone had stayed near the Temple Terrace apartment for most of that day, then switched to a different tower late that night as it moved west toward the causeway. Near midnight, there was a 27-minute gap with no calls or texts at all. A gap that, according to the records, placed his phone on the west side of the bridge. Investigators also connected Richie to Kalisa Kelly, his girlfriend of 7 years. Surveillance video placed the two of them together at a store in St. Petersburg. Richie told her he needed to take care of something, and left her there without the car she usually let him borrow. Kelly would later testify that even after his arrest, she kept visiting him in jail, kept calling, and kept putting money on his books so he could buy things at the commissary. Detectives later searched that car too. Separately, investigators noted that Richie owned two nearly identical suitcases. One was still in his car, the other was missing. DNA evidence would eventually connect Richie directly to the assault. None of this was known publicly yet. But investigators now had a timeline, a location, and a name. The day after Felecia was reported missing, detectives sat Richie down for an interview. On camera, he told them the situation was very complicated for him. The missing person case investigators had opened 2 days earlier wasn't a missing person case anymore. It took 5 years for the case to reach trial, a length of time not unusual for capital cases, which involve years of pre-trial motions, evaluations, and procedural review before a jury is ever seated. In September 2019, a jury of 9 women and 6 men was seated in Hillsborough County Circuit Court. Seating that jury alone took the better part of a week, in part because whoever sat on it would eventually have to decide between 2 outcomes: life in prison or death. Jurors watched Richie's recorded interrogation from 2014. They also heard again from Felicia's mother, this time in a courtroom rather than an interview. Until that Friday, jurors had only heard Felicia's name. That day, from a monitor above the witness stand, they saw her face for the first time, a bright-eyed 9-year-old with a gap-toothed smile. Prosecutors showed the jury a photograph of Felecia, smiling, and told them simply, "This is Felecia." Her family called her Sugar Plum. In his opening statement, Prosecutor Scott Harmon walked the jury through the state's theory of what had happened to her, piece by piece. The defense argued something different. Richie's attorney pointed to expert testimony suggesting there was no direct evidence of sexual battery and argued that signs of injury could have occurred while Felicia's body was in the water. He also suggested Wiley herself could have been responsible, pointing to her own past drug use. During cross-examination, Richie's defense attorney, Bjorn Brunvand, pressed Wiley on every earlier version of events she had given, working to show the jury she couldn't be fully trusted either. In his closing argument, Prosecutor Scott Harmon told the jury that Richie was a master manipulator who had lied to them and used both Wiley and his own mother to help cover up what happened. Throughout the trial, observers noted that Richie's demeanor barely changed, even when the state's first witness, Felicia's own mother, took the stand. The trial itself took nearly 2 weeks. When the case finally went to the jury, on September 25, 2019, the guilty verdict came back in just 4 hours. Jurors found Granville Richie guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, sexual battery, and aggravated child abuse. They agreed the killing had occurred during a sexual battery and child abuse, and that it had also been premeditated. The penalty phase began 2 days later. Prosecutors, led by Hillsborough State Attorney Andrew Warren, argued for the death penalty, describing the killing as heinous, atrocious, and cruel. The defense argued for life without parole. Richie's family testified by video link from Jamaica, asking for mercy. A neuropsychiatrist, Dr. Joseph Wu, testified that Richie had suffered traumatic brain injuries from past accidents and childhood abuse that may have affected his psychiatric state. A separate psychologist testifying for the defense said he had spent 32 hours evaluating Richie in jail before reaching his conclusions. On September 27, 2019, the jury unanimously recommended death. Formal sentencing didn't happen right away. Procedural steps, and later the pandemic, pushed it back nearly a full year. When the hearing finally took place on September 11, 2020, several members of Felicia's family spoke to the court, and to Richie directly. Felicia's mother told the judge she had waited 2,310 days for that morning to come. "I am here to stand as a wounded mother," she said. She brought a blanket into the courtroom that she'd made herself, printed with her daughter's photo. She told the court she wrapped herself in it during the hardest times. Felicia's grandmother told the court she still couldn't sleep, knowing what had been done to her granddaughter. Felicia's father asked Richie to seek forgiveness and told him he had already forgiven him himself. Judge Michelle Sisko, addressing Felicia's mother directly, said she was in awe of her bravery and of what she called her tireless advocacy for her daughter. Cisco found that the aggravating factors, Felicia's age, the fact that she was killed during a sexual battery, and what the judge described as extreme and outrageous depravity, outweighed everything the defense had presented in mitigation. She sentenced Richie to death, telling him there would be no redemption for his physical being in this life.
The jury unanimously found that defendant should be sentenced to death. As such, the court has now conducted its own weighing process as required by law. Mr. Ritchie, I need you to stand and please approach the podium.
Richie did not speak. Afterward, Hillsborough State Attorney Andrew Warren told reporters that Florida reserves the death penalty for the worst of the worst offenders, and that the rape and murder of a 9-year-old met that definition, if anything did. Nearly a year after the verdict, Judge Michelle Cisco formally imposed the sentence, calling what happened to Felecia horrendous, physically painful, and psychologically torturous. Ebony Wiley faced her own case, separately, for the false story she and Richie had built together. In October 2020, she pleaded guilty to providing false information to law enforcement. 2 months later, she was sentenced to 75 days in jail and 5 years of probation. A week after Felicia's body was found, hundreds of people came to her funeral to mourn her and remember her. After the jury recommended death, Felicia's family gathered to talk about her life, not just her death. Her aunt called her a great person, lovable, sweet, kind. Her sister said she'd carry Felicia's memory and celebrate her for the rest of her own life. Her mother put it more plainly. "As long as I know he's in that box for the rest of his life," she said, "that's all I care about, because my daughter is under all that dirt, in a box, for the rest of hers." One family member added something else, that she wanted people to remember this could be prevented. She asked people to say Felicia's name. 6 years later, when Ebony Wiley finally pleaded guilty to lying to police, Felicia's mother was in court to hear it. She called the plea deal a slap on the wrist. "We are the only ones punished forever," she said, "while you are punished for 6 months." Wiley had been 23 when she first met Granville Ritchie. By the time she stood in court to plead guilty, she was 30. Her mother has spent the years since trying to keep her daughter's memory from fading. Returning to court for hearing after hearing, in a case that has now outlasted most of Felicia's own childhood. Local reporters covering the case over the years gave it a shorthand of its own, the slaying of the Tampa girl known as Sugar Plum. It followed her and her family through every headline that came after. The sentence, once handed down, did not close the case. In Florida, a death sentence is only the beginning of another, much longer process. There was no formal process that would have required anyone to check Ritchie's background before that afternoon. Informal childcare arrangements between family friends rarely involve one, not in Tampa and not almost anywhere else. Under Florida law, a jury's death recommendation has to be unanimous. In this case, it was all 12 jurors agreed. Ritchie appealed. In June 2022, the Florida Supreme Court upheld his death sentence. A request for a rehearing was denied 2 months later, in August 2022. In August 2023, he filed another appeal, asking a judge to review his sentence again. In March 2025, he petitioned for an entirely new trial. As of this recording, Granville Ritchie remains on death row at Union Correctional Institution. Cases like his, capital murder convictions in Florida, often spend a decade or more moving through appeal after appeal before they're finally resolved one way or another. More than a decade after Felecia Williams called her mother to ask if she could spend an evening with a family friend, the legal process that followed her death still isn't finished. Thanks for watching Guilty Crime Files. These were cases involving ordinary people, and that's exactly why they matter. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because the right knowledge could save a life. Stay alert, and I'll see you in the next file. Felecia was left in the care of someone her family had every reason to trust, and almost no way to fully know. Wiley had called herself the girl's godmother. In the end, it was a title she carried into a courtroom, not a wedding or a christening, a title that meant she was supposed to protect Felecia, and didn't. If a single overlooked history could change what happened in that room, how many other rooms are one decision away from becoming this one? That question doesn't have a clean answer. It's the reason this file exists.